Hi again, it's Jason from Fraser Valley Rose Farm. Well, doesn't just about everybody want that fragrance, that history, that romance of the old garden roses in their garden? Well, yes, I think so, but the main objection I always hear from people who have done a little bit of research is, I don't want a rose that just blooms once in the garden. I want something that blooms all season, or at least in flushes throughout the season, so I can get some use out of that garden landscape that I've given them. Well, good news, I have some solutions for you. Some of the old garden roses, in fact, do rebloom throughout the season, and I'm going to break them up into 4 groups here. I don't say these class names or this group name to confuse anybody, but I think it will be useful for you as you're looking up other examples, maybe in a color I didn't mention. Then you can just look up the class name and it will give you the full listing of the roses that do similar in your garden. So the first group I'm going to talk about is characterized by the Portland roses. These also include some of the damask or damask perpetuals. The second group I'm going to talk about is the Bourbon roses. These are early hybrids between the damask roses and the China roses. The third group I'm going to talk about actually is those original China, tea, and Noisette roses. And finally, I'm going to talk about a catch-all category of roses from the, say, 18th century that's called the hybrid perpetual roses. So I've got those with timestamps up here on my left as I talk about this, and now let's get into the first group. Well, here's a great first example of the Portland group. This is a rose called Jacques Cartier. The Portland group is bred from the damasks, and they retain that same wonderful fragrance of the damask roses. But here you can see that refined form, beautiful flowers, this one in softest pink, and you can also see that the roses themselves, the flowers themselves, are held quite close into the shrub, leading to quite a tidy habit of the shrub. This one's fairly young, so it's small, but overall as a group, they're not too large. Let's get another example for one in the Portland group. You've heard me before praise Rose de Recht for its wonderful fragrance. Here you can see that the blooms are nothing to sneeze at either. Really quite nice multi-petaled blooms on, once again, what appears to be a very well-branched and compact shrub. Still in that Portland group, there are a couple of others you may be able to find on the market. Comte de Chambord is one of them, and Rose de Roy, which was important in the breeding of the modern roses. The Portlands have many garden benefits, including, again, that compact habit, beautifully formed roses, wonderful fragrance, and of course that they bloom all the way through the season. So that would be my first choice for a beginner looking for a reblooming old garden rose. The next group I want to talk about is a mixed bag called the Bourbon roses. They were initially bred in the island of Réunion, apparently between a couple of hedgerow roses, one being the Chinese rose, Old Blush, and the other one being the Autumn Damask. Those two came together and formed the mothers of the Bourbon class, and actually also were important in the breeding of modern roses. Some that came out of that, things like Souvenir de Malmaison, I'll put some of these pictures up on as I'm talking about, but also something as splashy as Variegata di Bologna, which it's just coming into bloom now. I can't show it to you, but I'll show you pictures of that as well. Sophie's Perpetual, which is a found rose presumed also to be in this class, that I can get you some footage of today. And in addition to those ones, let's talk about the modern climber, or sorry, the Bourbon climber called Zéphirine Drouhin, which is prized for being a thornless rose with a beautiful form, great scent, and the only downside, and it is a downside of the entire class of Bourbons, is they are a little more susceptible to foliar disease than other roses, so it can be hard to keep them looking healthy without relying on heavy-duty sprays, but overall they're still worth growing even if they are a little more problematic. Let's talk about China for a moment, because it can't be ignored that much of the reblooming character of modern roses comes from the old Chinese roses that have been bred over centuries and then only reached the horticultural trade worldwide somewhere around the late 1700s, early 1800s. So let's talk about Old Blush, Parsons Pink China Rose, which is one of the earliest that was collected and grown widely in the Western Hemisphere. And this one, as mentioned, was one of the important parents of the Bourbon roses. I have to say, on its own, it's charming enough to be used in a hedge and widely. It reblooms great, has a good scent, and has a good mid-pink color, so it stands up well in the garden. Next one I wanted to mention is Mutabilis, which is still widely available. Mutabilis doesn't give much in the way of fragrance, but makes up for it in its wide range of colors. They sometimes call it the butterfly rose because it's kind of wide open and has large petals that look like the fluttering of butterflies. It is yellow through pink with lots of shades in between, tends to darken over time, as do some of the China roses. Next I wanted to talk about Hermosa. Well, this one just has a form that won't quit. It's one of the early hybrids with the Chinese roses. Next I wanted to talk about blush Noisette. The Noisette roses were actually bred in America, not China, but from Chinese ancestors. And this one has a wonderful cluster flowering form and was again used as an important parent in the modern roses. And finally, while we're talking about the Noisettes and the tea Noisettes and all of the Chinese roses, I'll finish off with Crépuscule. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, so anybody who speaks French can correct me, but Crépuscule is a tea Noisette with a wonderful color, the color of sunrise or sunset, I guess is why it has that fun French name. Fourth and finally, let's talk about the hybrid Perpetual group, which actually is D, all of the above. It's the Portlands, the Bourbons, the Chinas, all mixed together into one genetic melting pot that became the dominant group of roses in the 19th century and set the stage for the modern roses, really. The hybrid Perpetuals were bred for larger flowers and better cut flower bloom form, but still retained much of the fragrance of the old garden roses. Some examples I'll give you real quick here. Paul Néron, which is just absolutely huge, peony-shaped flower, just completely globular and round, and even the buds look like peony buds to me. I have some of those in the garden right now. Also, I'll talk about Reine de Violette, the queen of the violet flowers or the purple flowers. This one is just a true deep purple, wonderfully fragrant, blooms all the way through the season. I find it to be quite healthy to grow, so I really have nothing to fault this rose for. Just to add on to some color range here, I'll talk about Ardoisie de Lyon, and actually Baron Giraud de Laine, which I have in bloom as well, so I'll show you some footage of that one, which is almost a perfect true red, but it has white markings around the outside of the bloom. Finally, let me just mention one more here, and I'll say Souvenir de Dr. Jamain is a climbing rose that's pulled from the hybrid Perpetuals, and it again is a velvety red color, great fragrance, and one of the finest climbers, even if it does need a little bit of babying to do well in the garden. All right, those are the four groups of the old garden roses, the true old garden roses that will repeat bloom in your garden. I'm going to mention one last thing here, which is to say this also has a fairly modern solution, which is that you go for the modern reproductions of the old garden roses. I'll see if I can get some footage here of, say, William Shakespeare 2000, which is an Austin rose that looks an awful lot like Charles de Mills and some of the old Gallicas. So if you look through the David Austin catalog, they have a lot of roses that, although they aren't true old garden roses, they do have some of the character and fragrance, and maybe that's good for you as well because they have the benefits of modern breeding techniques that impart disease resistance and so on. All right, that's everything I have for you too on the old garden roses that rebloom. If you have any questions about this, please drop them down in the questions below the video and I'll see what I can do to help.